Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Better Managers Briefing, this time on a Thursday before Good Friday. Welcome, I'm Anne Franca, I'm the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, and we try to bring you tips and news on management and leadership issues for these trying times. And today is a very, very central issue. It's about how do we govern in the new crisis and how are boards coping with this crisis. And I'm delighted to be joined by two experts. The first is our very own president and my chairman, Bruce Carnegie Brown, who also chairs Lloyd's of London and has chaired several other FTSE 250 companies and is the vice chair of the global bank Santander, as well as by Patrick Dunne, who is also a very experienced lecturer on good governance and the author of the best-selling book, Boards. And of course, both of them are chartered CMI companions. So welcome, Bruce and Patrick, to this session. And if I can just kick off. So obviously, boards need to behave very differently in a crisis. And what are some of the behaviors and process changes that need to happen? And how do the relationships change as well between, for example, the board and the executive? Bruce, if maybe I could start with you.
So I think it's quite useful to look at that question in the context of what I think of as the stakeholder wheel. And in my stakeholder groups, I have sort of 5 constituents in that wheel, which would be customers, employees, shareholders, the community, more broadly defined, and then regulators. And I think most commonly, businesses strive to put customers first, and if you do the right thing by customers, you end up doing the right thing by shareholders. And we've also talked in other CMI fora about the positive flywheel that goes between customers and employees. So if you have good employee engagement, you get good customer promoter scores. What I think has happened in this crisis is that employees have gone right to the top of the list. So people have focused very much on safeguarding their employees from this disease, and a lot of board activity has been focused on making sure that employees have the right safety around them. And this has involved, of course, a lot of remote working, and therefore of providing them with a lot of the remote working equipment. One of the issues that immediately arises is the negative impact that immediately has on customers. So if you take a simple example of a bank, and I think Alison Rose quoted a number for NatWest the other day, where in normal circumstances, their call center takes 3,000 calls a day. They are today getting 25,000 calls a day. So not only is the call center overwhelmed, but also, of course, a lot of the people who populate those call centers are either ill or working remotely, and it's taken time for banks to make sure that those remote workers have the necessary tools to do that. So you do get a fall off immediately in the customer experience, notwithstanding in the case of NatWest or any other bank, I think the best intentions of trying to help customers through this very difficult period. Second thing I'd say is I think boards naturally lean in. Everyone is eager to be well informed. So I think communication levels have to go up. And of course, communication levels need to go up anyway because of the remote working. And so that would be one of the facets that I would have experienced the last few weeks most acutely, is just the number of people you're trying to connect with through this crisis.
Mm-hmm. And Patrick, what about the change in the relationship that you see between the board and the chair and the exec at this time? How does that change?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, what stayed the same, and the things that have stayed the same is the board must be responsible and for determining have we got the right strategy, have we got the right resources, and have we got the right governance, whether it's a crisis or not. And especially in a crisis, you need to make sure of that. I guess the focus has been very centrally on resources in that. I think the balance between oversight and support of the board is very difficult at a time like this. Everyone wants to lean in, as Bruce says, but that mustn't be overwhelming the management. Sometimes you can smother the management with help. You actually need to let them get on and do the things that they need to do to get through the crisis. I think in terms of the nature of the balance between oversight and support, that for me is where there's been quite a shift in 2 weeks. I think people's minds and hearts are really with supporting. Now, these are very difficult things to do, to actually go through a process where as a board you're deciding, who gets to be chief executive if the CEO gets ill. And actually most boards I know have decided that in 2 steps. And what happens if that person that you've got as the stand-in then gets ill? So most boards I know have been planning a double layer of succession in that. I think being a responsible, doing the right thing is difficult when you cannot satisfy all the 5 elements of Bruce's wheel of stakeholders. We'll all have our own different things depending on the nature of business. I mean, one of the things I chair, we have a terribly difficult decision to take, which we've taken. We work in African slums. We cannot go into those slums where we would be endangering the people in there, bringing people in, and we would be endangering the people going into there. So we've had to pause. But how do those children get educated? And educated not just in terms of academic things, but educated in terms of health and keeping clean and keeping safe and all of those sort of things. Very difficult.
And of course, that's in the not-for-profit sector, which of course is very badly affected by this crisis as well. But we read of a number of boards that are taking very tough measures financially, things like cutting executive pay, which I think many people support, and bonuses, as well as furloughing, laying off workers, and suspending dividends. What's your view of these measures, and are there other things that boards should be doing to help firms financially during this crisis?
Bruce?
Well, I think it's critically an issue of risk management, and so in these early days of a crisis, cash flow is always king, and that's the issue to which people default. Clearly, also the urgent will crowd out the important in people's thinking, and I think that's legitimate at this point. But I think there'll be 3 phases to this. The first is survival. Can I survive? How long can I survive for? Am I making the right assumptions around the scenarios that are developing out there in terms of their severity and how long it might last? I think the second phase of this, which a lot of people are beginning to focus on, is how do I retain connection with employees, with customers, with other stakeholders, which in my case would include things like regulators. But I think there's a third phase that we increasingly need to devote resource to, which is the exit. What are the scenarios for recovery? And what is the long-term planning around here? If you look at the macro in all of this, what is happening is that government action, which I think is very appropriate, is swamping the country with indebtedness at a government level, at a company level, and at an individual level. And this is all part of the survival piece of this. But it's almost certainly unsustainable in the long term. So how are we going to recapitalize our economy at a government level, at a company level, and at an individual level as we come through this? And I think more and more people need to be giving thought to those issues if we're to have any kind of a soft landing out of this, because there clearly is a reckoning for everything that is going on, and there's been a huge amount of value destroyed through this process. And much as government is trying hard to mitigate that, it will ultimately get recognized in a number of different places with hardship if it falls unduly hard in one place rather than another.
So boards need to be thinking about the long term. Patrick, what are your views?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Bruce has said, but I'd also add that at times like this, we tend to behave as a society very suboptimally. We all do what we think is the best for our family, ourselves, our organization, which actually might not be the best for us all overall. So if you take the very difficult issue of the furloughing, it is incredibly difficult to make people redundant who will suffer serious personal hardship because of that. And I can't think of a director I know that doesn't really feel that deeply having to take that decision. And anything you can do to help there, you do. Actually, chopping your dividend sounds like a great deal in terms of stopping cash outflow, but actually in an environment where pensioners have getting very little on their savings, obviously apart from Santander and other good organizations, no dividend income is quite painful for a number of elderly people in our society. So I don't think we tend to think systemically. I think we tend to think at best organizationally, and I think there is a role for thinking actually and acting together. One of the concerns I have at the moment is that I think the business community and the government need to work more closely, and not as a regulator controlling government, but actually as a more supportive, thinking about the system as a whole.
Sure, and we'll come on to that very aspect in one of our later questions. It's an excellent point. But back to Bruce's stakeholder wheel. We've read a lot that some CEOs and chairs, obviously in North America, they are often the same individual, have taken this opportunity to dramatically change their thinking around responsible capitalism. So, for example, J&J's chair and CEO saying he's going to make COVID if J&J finds a vaccine, it will be not for profit, and he will not endeavor to profit from it commercially. A number of other big companies taking decisions to make big donations to charities or set up relief efforts for the NHS or others. What role do you think boards play in encouraging that kind of socially responsible capitalism? And do you have some favorite examples that you would share?
Well, I think all boards are engaged fully in this, if only from a perspective of protecting reputation through this period. And we all know how badly the banks performed in the financial crisis and the negative impact on their reputations. And so people are very focused on their reputations. That's somewhat selfish. I think there are also people, to Patrick's earlier comment, who are just trying to do the right thing and get the right balance in a very difficult environment, because most people haven't faced these issues before. But, you know, most obviously, there have been some very impressive statements made by US motor insurers, for instance, about returning premium to customers on their motor cars, because effectively the motor cars aren't being used at the moment, and therefore claims on motor car accidents are dramatically down. We haven't seen any of that yet in this country, and I think it would be a really positive step to take. I think banks have already announced a huge swathe of measures, whether they're holidays on mortgage payments or credit card payments, or even things like free over £100, which are kind of material financial help to customers, and quite short term, deliberately quite short term, because we go back to this issue of survivability. There's a real difficulty for the economy in operationalizing all of the government's good intentions. So the government has put in place, you know, a huge package of support, a bigger package of support than we've ever seen for the economy. But operationalizing that and getting it into customers' hands and users' hands as quickly as possible is a really difficult thing to do. And that's where banks and insurance companies and other market participants can play a real role. I was really impressed the other day talking to people in the manufacturing sector about the number of them that are repurposing their manufacturing capabilities, for instance, to develop masks. And how quickly they're able to do that, and how flexibly they've been able to change their manufacturing processes to do that and deliver them as quickly as possible, not for profits, to the NHS.
Those are great examples. And Patrick, if I may, a different take on the same question. Firstly, there are also some examples of companies behaving badly. For example, the football players not wanting to take a cut in salary despite having no football games, and furloughing the cleaning staff of stadiums. But my question is, reputationally, do you think that these gestures, good or bad, will have lasting impact on the reputations of those companies and their boards and how they took those decisions?
I think the reality is some will and some won't. So if you look at, you know, we've all criticized companies for not paying sufficient tax, but I mean, many of the same people who criticize them still carry on buying and using those products. So I think that will be just a fact of human nature. But I think, you know, I can think of two high-profile situations where, you know, those companies will suffer brand damage as a result of what they've done to communities where they've normally just taken them for granted. And those are obviously Wetherspoons and the well-known sports company in the Northeast. I mean, and you contrast that with some of the fantastic behaviour that others have done, you'll see that. I think where they'll affect their, if you think about what a brand, it's about what's in people's heads about a company. And I think it will affect what some companies have done in terms of their employment and their employees. I think that will affect their brands deeply. So I know from my sons, the word gets around very quickly about who are the really good employers and who aren't. So I mean, I chair the EY Foundation, and I've been absolutely staggered with how EY has supported its 18,000 staff in the UK through this. And then there's another firm I know where they've just basically let them get on with it.
Yeah. So what can boards do? You think about the role of the board, the role of the chair in encouraging greater responsibility. What do you think they should do?
So, I mean, I'll give you a practical example. So in the three things that I chair, and I'm sure the same is for Bruce, the moment you got wind of this, you had all your contingency plans, but you actually sat down and said, not just what do we have to do, but what should we do? What can we do? And how can we, as we go through this progressively, you're going to get some of those judgments wrong, but what do we need to do to shift? Actually involving people in that decision making, not just the board, is a good thing. So in each of those organizations, we've got people from elsewhere in the organization to take part in informing us about what we might need to do and how we might need to do it. So I think it's a cultural thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to come back to something that Patrick raised earlier, and again, get your views as well, Bruce. And this was, you mentioned it as well, Bruce, this unprecedented, unheard of government intervention that has taken place. Do you think it goes too far or not far enough? And Patrick already hinted that he thinks business should be working more closely with the government to mitigate the impact of this crisis. Do you agree? And you've touched a little bit on the banks. Are they really behaving as well as they could and should?
So in terms of what the government's doing, I think the government's doing an extraordinary amount, and I think they've also shown themselves to be adaptable. So where flaws in their plan have been exposed, I've been really very impressed with how quickly they've tried to adapt these to be inclusive of all sectors. And you look at the charities got left out in the beginning, and then yesterday we had £750 million directed to the charitable sector. Now, is it enough? Who knows at this point? But back to the survival piece, it's £750 million more than they've got today, and I think that is a very powerful endorsement of activity by government, and I think government will continue to do more if they need to do more through this period. And of course, none of us still knows yet how long this period is. I think the role of the private sector, if you like, in all of this is back to my comment before of operationalizing the way government delivers this aid. And this is the challenge. And banks, of course, are a big delivery mechanism, because we're mostly talking about money, and money mostly flows through banks. And it's the operationalization of this that is the hard part. I think banks are being a whole lot more responsive much more quickly than was the case in 2008, 2009. But in many ways, that's easy, because this isn't genuinely a financial crisis. This is a different kind of crisis. It's a health crisis first. There's now coming very dramatically an economic crisis. But the challenge for the banks is the one I kind of articulated right at the beginning, which is, much as they want to get this stuff to their customers quickly, and they have a lot of protection from government around the actions that they're taking, you physically got to be able to answer the phone and answer people's inquiries, and know that when you're answering their inquiries, you're abiding by what the government rules are, or the government guidelines are. And that's very difficult to do if half your workers are off sick, or if your call centers are remotely based and in India and are just closed. And so the customer initially experiences these very long queues for services that they want. Airlines is another good example, completely devastated by these events. But the customer experience is one of hanging on the phone endlessly to find out if you get a refund. The airline's then offering you a voucher, because guess what? That's smart for cash flow purposes, when theoretically under Consumer Credit Act, you're entitled to a refund. And so, how much tolerance should you have for the company trying to do the right thing, but doing it imperfectly, because they are also affected by the crisis. So again, I think I think back to Patrick's earlier comment, a lot of this is about providing support for each other through this. The blame game can come later, as long as people are well motivated and well engaged and trying to do the right thing. But you already see quite a difference of experience when you engage with different companies around some of the different issues that occur for you as a customer or as a user in the way these organizations respond. And I genuinely think there will be a difference in the reputations that emerge for the businesses that do really well in this period versus the reputations of those that don't. And what we're also discovering, of course, is our economic model has become very, very stretched over the last 15, 20 years. So the whole remote supply chains, it is becoming more of an issue. How do you source stuff when what governments tend to do is put their arms around things geographically? There was a good example, I think, of the US interrupting a supply of masks that were going from the US up to Canada and corralling them for the US Health Service, despite the fact that they were contracted to Canada. You know, that is not a particularly helpful thing to be doing. And I think Justin Trudeau made the comment about whether he should be preventing nurses going from Canada into the US every day for their place of work. And you just don't want to get into that level of winner and loser kinds of rhetoric at this point in the cycle.
That's very important, and obviously the politicization of this crisis and borders between countries is a whole nother topic, of course. But Patrick, you earlier said that you felt that business and government should be working even more closely, and perhaps businesses working together more closely. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think for all the reasons that Bruce has just evidenced, when some of these friction problems arise because you don't. But now is a time more than ever for things to come together. I think over the last 5 years in the UK, or maybe longer, business and government haven't been as close as perhaps historically they were. I think this may be a great opportunity for that. I mean, the other thing, just one more point on that brand point. I think one of the other things that will happen this time, as happened in the financial crisis, is that we'll all realize who our really, really best people are. New stars will emerge from this. And I think that goes for boards as well. I think there'll be many people on boards who are stepping up brilliantly at the moment. You probably realize who your next chair is now. They're very visible, the people who really step up and make a big difference. And there'll be people who you think, maybe I don't want to go through the crisis with that person next time. There'll be that too. But in any organization, I mean, you look at some of the heroic things middle managers in particular, I think, have done, because this has been very much, as Bruce says, around operationalizing a lot of things. You look at the way, really great managers have stepped in, made something happen when it didn't look as if it was going to be possible, persuaded people, simplified a problem, and got on with it, and delivered a result that's been great for the organization and great for the customer.
That's a really good point, and one I know many of our members will be delighted to hear. So I know we have a lot of audience questions, but I just want to very quickly ask each of you, how much do you think these new ways of working and the things that you've talked about will deliver lasting changes to the way we manage, how boards govern? Will capitalism become more responsible? Do you think that this will last beyond this crisis?
Well, it's quite interesting. When I look outward at this, rather than asking myself that question from my own styles of governments and the things that I impose, I've been looking at the regulator, and I've been seeing the regulator dropping a whole bunch of regulatory requirements that they've been making of financial services companies, precisely to allow financial services companies to focus on these very urgent issues. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, if we can do that in a time of urgency, why can't we do that in the ordinary course of business? And you've got to be a little bit fair to say, it goes back to my comment earlier about the urgent crowding out the important. There are still important things here that are going to get postponed through this process, and it's about allocating resources, as Patrick said earlier, appropriately through this. But I do think there's a real opportunity for different ways of working, and the longer remote working goes on, the more people are beginning to learn about how to do things differently. And if we could save people that hour each way commute at minimum to work every day, think of the productivity opportunities and the well-being opportunities that might come out of that. As well as cost drivers. I mean, it could be a lot cheaper to produce what we produce if we're able to do things more remotely. I mean, but again, on the other side, of course, you've got the whole issue of social interaction. People genuinely like the social interaction, and we've got to be careful that we don't throw out good things when we're trying to change the ways we operate.
I was going to say, Bruce, but just before you come in, Patrick, that you and I did learn how to set up a Google Hangout.
Shush, don't let us down. We've
learning
learned that all along.
So anyway, Patrick, what will be lasting for you?
I think one big lasting thing will be people's approach to risk and risk management. So I think that we'll think more about planning for consequences than planning for causes, as I describe it. So most risk matrices have events in them. This happens, that happens. Whereas actually what we've learned here is it's the consequence that's the thing you've got to plan for. So factories closed, schools closed, call centers closed, those sorts of things. I think there'll be a bit of a shift in the way that people think about risk, because pandemic was in that top right hand box for many organizations for quite a while. Very big impact if it happens. It moved around the sort of middle to top quadrant, but pandemic as a thing, well, what does that mean? Whereas actually our people can't get to the factory, we can't deliver. Those consequences are probably more interesting to plan for.
So the consequence rather than the cause. Thank you both. Got a lot of questions. The first is from Charlie. How do you balance the need to manage the daily challenges remotely to keep the business going and the staff motivated now, whilst planning in a very uncertain world, and the need to keep looking outwards at the bigger picture? Actually, Bruce, you referenced this. Maybe you want to come in first.
Well, I think this is a really good question, and I don't pretend to have a real truth on it. And I think your experience day to day in your management life is that it's what is it that's on your agenda versus on everybody else's agendas you deal with. And managers can get taken prisoner, I think, by other people's agendas and not spend enough time on their own. And this is no different. So it's about allocation of your time. And clearly you get swamped by the things that are urgent here, and the risk is you're not looking enough at the long-term issues. And I see this in my dealings with the Treasury. There are lots of things that we're looking to the Treasury to do to help to help the financial services industry deliver value back to customers at this difficult time. And they're only interested in things that happen tomorrow or can get done tomorrow. And it's unsurprising. They've got a limited number of resources. They've got political masters who are interested in announcing initiatives that are helpful to people out there. But a lot of the, as I commented on before, I think a lot of planning now needs to go in for how we exit this crisis. And finding the capacity to spend time on that, and finding then other people, because you need other people to engage with on these issues, is hard. And actually, that's the when boards, I think, can be helpful, because boards, on the whole, are non-executive. They're not dealing with the day-to-day issues that is faced by the company. And so they can be getting together. And indeed, I have got together with some of my fellow board members, both in the insurance industry and in the banking industry, trying to galvanize thinking processes around these kinds of issues for how we kind of exit this crisis in due course. But it's not easy, but I do urge people to take a proactive stance on this and try to carve out the right time or find the right resources to help them with it.
I mean, practically, what we've been doing in the organisation I chair is we've got a sort of COVID task force, and within that, some people are very focused on the here and now, the operational stuff, and some people are focused on the next phase and phases. And I think expecting everyone to think about all of it, other than the obviously the board, is unrealistic given the incredible pressure that people have been under. So somehow having some people focused on what happens in the next phase and beyond that, and a really rapid triage team focused on how do we deal with it here and now is probably the way that you can manage it.
And just to build on that, Patrick, maybe you want to comment on a question from Roz, which speaks to the here and now. What advice should boards give to execs whose people are exposed to the personal risk of COVID?
I think it's incredibly difficult if you're running a hospital. Some of my friends are on hospital boards. One of my friends yesterday, they're not allowed in the hospital. They're on the board, and she was feeling huge pain around asking and directing, if you're on the board, other people to go into a situation that you can't. I think that's an incredibly difficult, stressful thing to do. But you have to go back to what are the objectives of the organization and what is the best thing to safeguard your people, your customers, and so on. And if you start with those basic sort of integrity, responsibility issues, and then profit has to come later in this context. So there's some things that have been open. You really got to ask yourself, are they really essential? Do you really need that at the moment? But other people's jobs will depend upon that thing happening. So you have to balance these things. But at the end of the day, it's like pretty well most things for boards, it's about judgment. You have to make a judgment, and we will be held accountable for the judgments that we take through this. And most directors know and appreciate that.
Sure. So the next question actually is a judgment question, and I'll ask Bruce. It's a question from Michael. At this time, what is the most powerful question a team coach can ask a board?
I think it's really around how the board works together on the urgent issues. And so it gets back to Patrick's comment around risk management and have we got the right things at the top of our list, and goes back a little bit to my comment on the shareholder wheel, the stakeholder wheel. If customers are now second to employees, how are we managing that issue across that dynamic? But most importantly, I think from a coaching point of view, it's how we're getting people to work together to get the best out of each other, whether it's triaging to put people in separate teams to focus on different issues. It's about who we ask to come into the office versus who we ask to work remotely, making those decisions well. It's one thing to have agonies over national health staff going in to do their job. To me, that is a national emergency, and it's unsurprising that we ask them to do that. And I think many of them would be very upset if we stopped them having that opportunity to serve in that way. Much more balanced to the judgments that we talked about earlier about call centers or supermarkets needing to be open and putting people in harm's way effectively by serving customers who need to get their shopping done. And so what you've already seen in supermarkets as you get through week 1 and week 2 is people putting up much better defenses for their staff, whether it's perspex fronts to the cashiers, or whether it's social distancing in terms of access into the supermarket. And I think a lot of this is about bringing boards together to figure these things out, but very much collectively, and playing to each other's strengths to get the best out of them.
Sure. And this is now our last question, and it kind of hints at what Bruce was talking about, and I'd be interested in Patrick's advice. So it's great when boards are fleet of foot and get the communication out, but her question from Joanne, what about when that's not the case? How can we best manage and give direction to members of a team as middle managers when I'm waiting for the steer from corporate and from my board, but I don't have it, and my team members are pushing me for a response there and then? What do we tell Joanne, Patrick, as a board chair? What would you tell her?
Well, I'd sort of go back to my own experience, a while ago as a middle manager, and think, actually, what have I got to do to get the right thing done? And sometimes that's just the way that you make your request. So, and sometimes it's taking ownership. So you can take ownership by saying, this is what I'm proposing to do unless I hear otherwise. Now, if you have the trust and you have the confidence of your board, they'll probably respond very quickly and say, yeah. But if you don't, then you're in a different situation. I think you have to force the issue sometimes, and also you have to understand it from the board's point of view. Is that really a board issue? Or is that an issue that the CEO should be decided upon? So in the early stages of this, I think most boards gave their CEOs probably greater autonomy than they would have had, just a week before. That actually, on this range of issues, we trust you. You decide on those. We're mandating you to do that because collectively we need to use our board time on these other issues. So I think a shift in what was delegated happened. Now, whether that's clawed back once we get out of the situation is an interesting point, but it's very difficult if you're in the middle and you need an answer on something. So I would always frame when I was I'm going to do this. unless I hear otherwise type of way. Not in a an arrogant way or a cocky way, but in a kind of because it needs to be done by then.
Sure. Well, we have run over, so I do want to bring it to a close. I want to thank you both very much. That's some outstanding insights and comments there. And I just want to close by saying, as you are both on my board, Bruce as chair and Patrick as a board member, you've both been incredibly supportive to CMI, to all of our employees and stakeholders at this time. And so I just want to say thank you for that. And happy Easter, everybody, and enjoy the good weather, but stay safe.
Stay safe.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.